The real apartheid is to support and speak at these conferences. Historically black colleges and universities are just more racism and don't accomplish anything. Having your own space is just more racism and sexism and doesn't fix anything. The premise being offered here is very clear. It is a reverse racism perspective shared by my friends and many other people I know and work with, even professionally, that think that by having spaces specifically dedicated for the use of, say, black people gathering together and things like that, that it is just more racism. Of course, this applies to other conferences as well, and that, reverse sexism and all those other things that people like to say. And so the contention here is that having these underrepresented minority spaces is just as bad as segregation. For example, Jim Crow or apartheid, as the many people have unfortunately said to me at this point by now, among other things. And of course, right, they want to be very, very clear that what they're trying to say here is that a conference, a social gathering that excludes people based on their skin color is racist, right? Whether they're white or black or any other kind of shade of human skin. So obviously, they don't believe in this idea of positive discrimination, whatever that means. And as I offered to do, I said that I would put together evidence and some education about why that doesn't work. So the idea of these solutions that my friends and many others are trying to peddle to me is that I need to attend the old spaces or replicate them and then attempt to improve on either formula or what they've done. Or I just need to educate them, right? Educate them at some point in their lives or whatever else in order to successfully combat this kind of sexist racism. And that at no point should I be thinking about making my own spaces, or anyone else should be thinking about making their own spaces. And I should absolutely not be thinking about attending these spaces as well. So let's start with a very, very intrinsic part of this, which is that the current spaces that we have right now do not work. And this is going to be a proof by contradiction, right? So the criteria that we have set out here for any space is that it has adequate content and it is accessible to beginners, and some kind of friendly, right? To whether it's to beginners or experts, anyone on the spectrum, right? As long as you're catering to your target audience, right? That's the goal, right? So to contradict that, right, we have to prove one of those previous statements false. So either the space has inadequate content for your target audience, or it is inaccessible to beginners, or it is hostile, right? So we need to prove one of these statements false. Now, obviously, we can't prove the first statement false because, how could you possibly say that, right? I mean, the amount of resources available to both beginners and experts in the C++ community, in the C communities, and various other places is vast. So I guess that only leaves hostility as a thing that we need to think about. So is there hostility, right? And the way you figure this out, the way you prove this hostility is you would have to find out a trackable, recordable, repeatable issue, or you'd have to find leadership that kind of fosters an in-group or has egregious breaches, of the social contract, right, of basic human dignity. So we need to figure out a way to measure that hostility. Now, what we can do is we can start with a proxy for maybe hostility, right? By measuring participation, right? Participation is a pretty good way to find out if there might be some hostility somewhere. Now, of course, that's not always true, right? Some people just don't want to participate because they don't care for it, because it's not catered to them, because the space is just not what they're looking for, right? So you can't just say that lack of participation is hostility. You need to actually go check the hypotheses and look at the data and see whether or not that is actually the case. So we're going to use women in computer science, right? We're going to start with women in computer science because information on other kinds of underrepresented minorities in computer science is substantially underdeveloped. Of course, for women, there's about 40 plus years of this data. So we're going to look at that and try to detect, is there some kind of hostility that is keeping them out, or is it just kind of some lack of interest? So we're going to look at a lot of different data. We're going to look at statistics, obviously, from the real world. We're going to look at psychology and neuroscience and other, informatics and cross discipline papers that are published in various different journals, whether they're longitudinal studies or case studies or qualitative reports or quantitative articles. And we're also going to look at, we're going to pull a lot of our data from the U.S. Census Bureau, the Open Economic Cooperation and Development place. We're going to also pull data from Eurostat. We'll look at the Australian government's publicly available data, the Ministry of Education, Brazil, Vietnam, and more. All right, so we're going to look at everything we can get our hands on, right? So let's start with the participation, right? So women are essentially 50% of the population, right? Depending on what country you look at, you're looking at 42% to 51%, right? And you're talking millions and millions or hundreds of millions of people, or in some cases, billions of people. The participation in computer science and science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, though, is vastly lower than that, right? So there is a participation difference here, right? 11% if you're in the Czech Republic, or say 30% if you're in Bulgaria. And of course, we want to remind people of the law of large numbers here, right? So if you observe a lot of something, a lot of the same thing in some similar-ish category, right? It tends towards the true value of it, right? This is something that people take advantage of in ray tracing and a bunch of other stuff to produce, high fidelity images. So we observe that if women make up about 50% of the population, where's the eventual 50% reflection in large populations in STEM fields, right? So if everything is equal, all things are held equal, and you wanted to take a sampling of any subpopulation, the idea is that if it is an egalitarian or equal place, you would eventually just see kind of a direct reflection of the population of that nation or that culture inside that specific thing, right? So why are there not 50%, or about 50% populations of women in STEM fields, and particularly in computer science? So the hypothesis here is that hostility exists. And of course, this is important to set this up like this because it means that the null hypothesis, which is the default that is always assumed if you can't prove that hostility exists, is that there is no hostility, right? So our hypothesis is that hostility exists, and our null hypothesis is that there is no hostility, and that nothing is wrong. So that means that the burden of proof is on us to prove that there exists hostility, right? That's the way you set up these, statistical experiments and other kinds of experiments, right? Unfortunately, it's incredibly easy to prove this. And I'm not just talking about reports about like surveys and things like that. I'm talking about actual statistically significant qualitative data that has been peer reviewed and multiply reproduced in many different scenarios, right? So women and outsiders have adverse effects for GitHub pull requests, right? Regardless of the quality of the input, right? When you looked at women who face discrimination, and people who face discrimination based on gender, at least 1/3 of women face that discrimination based on their gender, right? In open source repositories across the world. Okay, so that's pretty damning that they were able to find within a beyond a shadow of a doubt of statistical significance that this was happening in many cases. But it goes beyond that, right? There are whole country reports and whole domain reports. Like, for example, the European Commission is a branch of the European Union, which means that Europeans paid tax dollars to have these people go out and try to figure out policy support for various different parts of their lives. And in one of those particular documents, I believe D17 and D19, there is a document on free Libra open source software and ways to support it, right? And so as part of this report, they found that women are actively, even if unconsciously, excluded rather than kind of passively disinterested in software, in computer science. And they talk about the effects and the exclusion and the way that they were able to figure that out and how they found that data, right? This was done in 2006. So it was a very old report that's been around for almost, give it a couple months and it'll be 15 years. There's also other studies done at smaller universities and other places that look into specific communities, whether it's Debian or elsewhere, that have found evidence of not only lack of participation, but sometimes unconscious bias and discrimination in these communities, okay? So there's a large body of evidence that kind of proves that this is the case, beyond a statistical reasonable doubt, okay? It's also in industry reports, right? So this is, for example, a picture from Kate Gregory's blog at TechEd in 2004. And this picture is essentially a manifestation of the fact that the conference didn't really believe that there were any women that were going to be using the restroom, so of course they would just convert it to a men's restroom. But if Kate Gregory is in attendance, well then how does one of your featured individuals actually go to the bathroom if you've repurposed all of the women's restrooms to be men's restrooms? Side note, this was actually a popular tactic when done on purpose. TechEd didn't do this on purpose. Obviously, they weren't trying to make Kate's life miserable. But this was actually a popular tactic that has been used, I believe, even into the 21st century, called bathroom leashing or urinary leashing, where they would make it difficult for women to participate in events by essentially making it so that they had to walk ridiculously long ways or go out of their way to find basic amenities to help themselves. So, for example, restrooms, wash closets, etc., etc. So, an accident at Tech Ed, but something that they actually ended up doing anyway. There's also been industry reports more recently about the ways that women need to conduct themselves in order to actually be successful and survive in the technology field, in computer science. This is from Patricia Ash, who has spent a long time in open source and a long time, of course, in closed source circles as well, putting out this kind of report about the ways that you survive the bigotry that exists in tech and the unconscious and conscious biases that people will deploy against you if you are a woman. And of course, some of those tips also apply to other underrepresented minorities. Not only that, but we see that this stuff is also replicable across the world, right? Whether you're looking at the United States in higher education institutions, or you're looking at the industry, or you are taking a look at the other places in general, right? Whether it's India or Rwanda, Japan, Brazil, Australia, the evidence for the amount of discrimination and hostility that exists in tech is pretty astoundingly high. Okay, there does seem to be some, there does from the data and from multinational consensus appear to be a discrimination and a hostility that exists towards women in particular. But it's not just women, it applies to other groups as well. Whether it is Asian Americans, whether it is Asians in general, in, for example, Korea or China or places like Vietnam or Cambodia, there is actually demonstrable, provable, qualitative and quantitative reports composed by whole regions, whole countries, groups of nations, individual nations, and many other places that show, both by the numbers and elsewhere, that we are actually not doing very well on all fronts. And so, obviously, I mean, these are a couple of quotes from some of the articles below, but basically, tech has had a very big problem in being able to not only recruit but retain a diverse body of talent. And it's not even just the reports or even from women themselves, but you can even take it from, Linux Jesus himself. When Torvalds took a break from the Linux kernel development, he said that when he comes back, he's going to put in place a code of conduct and a bunch of other stuff. And now, of course, the whole community exploded when this happened. Of course, with accusations of social justice warriors, among other things, flying out. But as people kept trying to speak over and for Linus, he actually sent an email to the BBC to further clarify his position, some of which I will reproduce here. He said, "I absolutely do not want to be seen as being in the same camp as low-life scum on the internet that think it's okay to be a white nationalist Nazi and have some truly nasty, misogynistic, homophobic, or transphobic behavior. But I do claim that it never ever was any kind of nastiness. I got upset with bad code and people who made excuses for it and used some pretty strong language in the process. Not good behavior, but not the racist, etc. claptrap some people spout. So in the end, my I really don't want to be too PC stance simply became untenable. Partly because you can definitely find some emails from me that were simply completely unacceptable and I need to fix it going forward. But to a large degree, also because I don't want to be associated with a lot of people who complain about excessive political correctness. What Linus began to realize is that the rhetoric that he was using of tech above everything, to the point that you can be a jerk, to the point that you swear at everybody and use all caps and whatever else you have, demonstrated that his rhetoric and his ability was essentially allowing people with some very nasty views to show up in not only kernel development, but other open source projects that replicated the kind of ideas and thought process that went into trying to create the communities around these places. And so by replicating Linus's behavior, and as Linus himself has realized, it gave an out for those who are truly bigoted and nasty to support themselves by saying, listen, as long as we talk about technology, we can say whatever other additional stuff we want to, no matter how nasty it is, because we're focusing on the technology, right? This is all about the technology. Any other accusation, the other is just me being a little bit too passionate, but it's okay because it's about the technology, right? And if even Linus can realize that, hey, maybe we're being the baddies, you've probably got a lot of problems in your community. But what I really wanted to emphasize is that the data shows that there really isn't like a lack of interest problem, or I'm not interested problem, or I don't have time for this problem. What a lot of the data overwhelmingly shows is that there is a massive amount of interest, especially in young girls, in computer science and in other technical fields. But what happens is over time is that they are excluded and discriminated against and harassed, even if they manage to make it to the point where they actually want to contribute to things like open source. So there is genuinely an anxiety, fear, discrimination, and harassment problem in the industry, right? This is stuff that has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt, beyond a shadow of a doubt, in multiple decades of scientific literature and in across multiple different countries. Thankfully, it's not all gloom, right? So educational improvements are happening across the board, and a lot of numbers are increasing in early education. There's a lot of people that spend a lot of time talking about what exactly attracts them to technology, but in cases of, say, like India or a couple other places, what they find is that the reason the numbers are a little bit higher in those places than, say, the U.S. and other countries is because there is an explicit okay that it is fine for women to do computer science. That is an okay field for them. And in fact, this replicates early United States numbers where they also had high participation from women in computer science, because at the time it was seen as work that women were supposed to do. So when they would go to school and they would learn to do, quote, secretarial work, they would also learn computer science because that is what they were expected to do when they left. Unfortunately, despite the number of programs and things that have turned around the educational decline in computer science, what we're actually finding is that this is actually only manifesting in early education. And places that are lagging behind are places like the industry itself. Right, so this is from a study that looked at the role of education. It said the results show that access to education is not a solution in and of itself. It's only one part of what should be a multidimensional policy-making approach. There is no simple solution. And when you begin to dig into that report and you begin to look at other reports that report similar things, you find out that underrepresented minorities are leaving their jobs at 1.5 to 2.5 times the rate of their peers. And not only that, but underrepresented minorities are also not making it to PhD levels of research and similar. In fact, the global research pool is almost 72% male in science, technology, education, and mathematics, and it gets a little bit worse for computer science. So this is a direct rebuttal to essentially what my friends have been trying to tell me during the conversation, that, well, because they're discriminated at early stages, that's why they don't show up at these conferences, right? And that's actually not exactly the case. What we find is that there's also discrimination and hostility at higher levels, right? And that's why you can't just start when they're young and in school, because if you support them up through school and then drop them on their face when they get to the industry, or when they start trying to penetrate into master's degree programs and PhD programs, then you're still going to end up with the same problem, no matter how many additional students you're trying to funnel into the industry. And this makes it important, right? Education will never be enough to tackle and solve the problems that are before us, right? This has been reported in multiple different reports all over the globe. You can't just have education. You have to have a cohesive policy-making approach that includes the industry and the workplaces and the various other higher levels and higher echelons of these communities and these industries. We also have pretty strong evidence that the workplace and the industry are toxic, right? So in the US and elsewhere, what we're actually finding is that there's all kinds of different discrimination, and that discrimination is imported even from other countries. So for example, India actually has imported caste system discrimination into many places in the European Union and into the United States. A study was done by the United Kingdom to help inform whether or not caste system discrimination should be put as part of the Equality Act of the nation. And what they found is that there was actually caste system discrimination that had permeated not only most of their jobs, but even even white collar jobs such as technical fields. This also was found to be the case in the United States and in other countries as well. We also found that there was also lots of discrimination against women in various different conferences, right? Most keynote speakers in most technical conferences could report harassment of some kind and discrimination of some kind at these conferences, right? From Black and Indigenous people of color who reported 62% to others who reported a 53%, right? So we also have an initial problem in the growth in the industry, right? And the growth in these conferences and other places that we want to participate in, right? So individual conferences are basically providing the majority of growth for women and Black Indigenous people of color. So for example, the TNW conference was basically responsible for 5% of all the growth in the women who are presenting at these conferences since 2017, right? And then literally every other conference combined basically only amounted for 4%, right? And that's because TNW had a specific push to put more women who were technically competent to give presentations and everything else at these various places. So we see that we're actually lacking in growth opportunities for women in the industry and in our workplaces and in the places where we celebrate those people who do work, right? And to get even worse, like system programming conferences are actually doing the worst here. Now, finding out the numbers for this are really difficult because I reached out to a lot of organizers and well-known folk and I started asking them questions, and unfortunately 90% of them didn't get back to me, whether it was emails to Hanselman or a bunch of other places. They couldn't really connect me with people who were interested in getting the data. And after a while, I kind of got discouraged in sending out emails and getting back nothing. But there were some people who did get back to me, but unfortunately, the story was basically universal. They weren't collecting that data. So I had almost nothing to go on. So in order to figure out at least a little bit of data that's more relevant to specifically the CS Plus community, I went the old-fashioned way, right? A lot of conferences featured their speakers, give links to bios and everything else, right? So what I did is I went to every single conference that I knew of, that I had attended or thought of attending, and many more that I probably would never attend, and began to basically go through their speaker pages and everything else to figure out what was the representation like, right? If you want to get into the industry, you need to be able to see yourself in 5-10 years doing things that those other people are doing, right? And much science has proven that you need to be able to see role models, especially role models that look like you, that show you that there is a path, yes, from going to school, but also to exiting into the industry itself, right? So are there those role models, and do we have enough of that representation? In this case, because I'm counting the numbers myself, I can actually get data on other underrepresented minorities, and specifically I'll be focusing on Black statistics, right? I mean, the other statistics are dismal, but, we'll focus on Black statistics. So remember the law of large numbers, right? We want a sufficiently large population pool, conferences basically over their entire lifetime, and what we hope is that the numbers will tend towards true value the more and more of it you observe, right? And so what we're hoping is that in an egalitarian society or an egalitarian conference, you will effectively see that over time, it will basically trend towards the percentages of the various places that these conferences are held at. Now, the majority of the conferences I looked at are basically in the European Union, the United States, or claim themselves to be international conferences. So these are some of the percentages of the populations that you would expect to eventually show up in these places for the work that they're doing. Unfortunately, the numbers are vastly disappointing. Whether they are United Kingdom conferences, or whether they're United States, or whether they're in Norway or somewhere else, the numbers are always disappointing, right? And sometimes it's literally just me as a speaker showing up at these places, kind of propping up the numbers on my lonesome. But what we see is that there's really not a lot of representation, at least in recent conferences. Of course, this doesn't get any better when you start looking at even more conferences in various different places, or even try to change the year. Sometimes the numbers drop off and everything else. Now, this isn't exactly the greatest representation, right? Because this is just a single year, right? We want to look at conferences over time. But even for things like Rust conferences, or BuildCon or Build or .NET specific conferences, we don't see great representation of Black individuals, right? That meet any of the demographics of anywhere that they're targeting. So what is going on here, right? Now, obviously, some people would object to this because this just looks like quotas, right? Like, are you just saying that we just need to get the percentages up? Like, and no, that's not what I'm saying. I don't want you to just try to artificially inflate percentages or stuff as many people in until you meet some magical number, right? But what I do want to see is over time improvement, or at least some amount of penetration into the industry and into the conferences that represent those industries showing up, right? So you would think that over time we would improve, right? So for example, for over a 5-year span of CEPCon, we basically made almost no movement despite having almost 70 plus new speakers added to the pool. This is also similar for ACCU in that from 2002 to 2019, we basically have seen no growth in diverse individuals showing up to speak at these conferences, right? And these are conferences that claim that hold themselves to international or at least statewide for the United States acclaim, right? So, okay, maybe that's just not good enough, right? What about the averages? And it turns out the averages are really terrible, right? If you focus on 2019 and 2020, we do a little bit better those years than most other years. But if you focus on the lifetime, it goes down dramatically. So even in the aggregate lifetime, we're not really doing well recently or at all. Gee golly willikers, right? It's basically a flat line. It's flat lines everywhere. There's no improvement or no growth going on. What's happening, right? So is this hostility? Remember, it's just a lack of participation. We still need to confirm whether or not there is actually hostility in systems programming, or in particular the C and C++ communities. And this is where we start drilling down and getting, more specific. The C++ communities and the industries are actually pretty toxic. This is a tweet from Titus Winters, who was the chair of the Library Evolution Working Group, right? And what it reads is, I'm not surprised. WG21 is where I get my U.S. recommended daily allowance of ad hominem, unprofessional behavior, etc., right? So this is, someone who has basically chaired one of the largest groups at the highest echelons of C++. And he has found unprofessional behavior, right? So what is the way to evaluate whether or not, Titus telling you? Now, obviously, it's not like I don't believe Titus. I mean, he's a wonderful, upstanding person. But obviously, we need to corroborate this, right? So let's go through a little bit of a personal journey. This is the very first talk I gave at CS Plus Now. It was lightning talk. And it was titled, it was like, where should I be, or and things like that. And so I kind of talked about how I didn't really belong in the white community while I was growing up. I didn't really belong in the Black community while I was growing up, but I felt like I could belong in the C++ community because it was supposed to be technical, right? It was supposed to focus on the technology, right? So and this person, strangely enough, very shortly after I leave this talk, a comment shows up saying, "Where's the C++?" Now, this is a lightning talk, right? So it's not supposed to be the most technical thing in the world. In fact, it can be about anything. You can talk about the lunch you had yesterday. But this comment showed up, and people upvoted it, whatever, right? Obviously, people are just having a little bit of fun, or that's just what I thought. As the days went by, I kept getting contacted by the same person who was the one who made this comment. And as things continued to progress, right, they felt the need that they needed to say, direct message me about, like, say, my proposals and other things, and tell me how to engage professionally with the rest of the committee, right? So at this point, I'm like writing papers, I'm getting used to the committee, and I'm being told the proper way to write papers, to engage on technical subjects, right? And completely fair, right? Wonderful, lovely advice about, trying to avoid being colorful and focusing on, being sterile and technical and dry. So we go about doing that, but this exact same person then sends emails so bombastically and flagrantly unprofessional that the face that you see on the right-hand side here is the exact same face I was making. Now, obviously, I can't show you the email itself because this one was sent to the International Standards Organization mailing list, right? And ISO, requires that everything there is private, so of course the email is redacted. But you'd like to see a public version that was sent to a public mailing list, you can follow the link below, and it will take you to the public version of this. And it's a little bit watered down than the verbal assault that was conducted under this blacked out box here. But it's still no less humiliating and no less combative in its intentions and tone. In fact, this individual became so toxic that it even came up during a review of a library, right? So they're talking about why certain individuals weren't submitting feedback to this library on this mailing list, right? And one person writes, there's a little bit before this, but it says, as negative review feedback would be ignored, possibly with personal retribution thereafter, and the library was going to be accepted in any case. So it would be a wasted effort, and they haven't bothered. They haven't bothered sending in a review. And without ever coordinating with this individual, right? Without ever talking to this individual about how they felt and about the people that contacted them, I personally found people who absolutely were not going to participate in the review of this library for the exact same reasons, right? That it wasn't worth it, and the personal retribution and the unprofessionalism and everything else. Some people were a little bit confused when they said personal retribution, but this is the same person that went out of their way to specifically name people on the committee and attack them in publicly available forums and everywhere else. It wasn't even hidden at all. You could find it on Reddit, Twitter, Slack, email, you name it. They were firing off consistently. But the same person who wrote me that comment about how to be professional and how to focus on C++. And so they go at it, and they absolutely just fill every space they possibly can with just complete ad hominem and other attacks on people, to the point that the people that they called out had to actually spend time in Slack and on Reddit and on Twitter talking about and refuting these ideas that the person went all the way. They started saying that the people were in cabal, that it was some kind of coordinated push by big tech to do evil things, right? That Apple was in on it and Facebook was in on it, full on conspiracy theory stuff. To the point that they actually had to respond against those accusations. So, for example, this one person said, "I do not participate in cabals, councils, or cults. I had enough of that in childhood. I love technical discussion and will participate in those threads," right? Of course, when the initial person sent that email out talking about personal retribution and the reason why people wouldn't bother to submit reviews for fear of retaliation and other things like that, everybody in that mailing list acted completely, they were surprised, that how could this possibly be the case? This is a technical mailing list and we should focus on the technical merits. And And how could you even say that personal retribution could ever come into this effort? And they're just completely shocked that this is the case, that somebody could possibly even insinuate that a person could do this. And it just makes you wonder, like, is any one of their five senses even working? Is there a firing synapse in their head that could just look around and see a multi-platform waged war against specifically named individuals, reading from their personal blogs and quoting from them there to make fun of them? It was a mess, right? And it's detrimental to the community, to the Boost community at large, right? Because in 1999, when they actually were focused on the tech, when they actually were focused on pushing the envelope, right, they made progress. But in 2020, and even for the past 3 years, Boost has kind of had this consistent and perpetual identity crisis about what they're supposed to be doing and why people aren't, interested in submitting libraries to Boost as opposed to going directly to standardization, complaining that the committee is too fast, that certain things aren't too baked, and that, and constantly, asking the question on the mailing list, why don't people want to submit? And even when people tell them that it's because the mailing list is combative and unfriendly, they usually just brush that off and ignore it. But it's not just like toxicity that's just like in general. The toxicity in Boost and other places, right, is like specifically targeted at women, at other underrepresented minorities, right? So here's an example from one of the threads where a prominent Boost poster stops to say, I think the main reason behind the low participation of women in C++ is that many women simply don't find C++ and programming in general very interesting as an occupation. Similarly to Matchbox toy cars, right? I can't tell you the number of times I hear developers, online and offline, at conferences and elsewhere, that complain about marketing BS. They complain about like the way the USB spec labels their stuff because it's just marketing garbage, right? They complain about the way that technology is marketed to them because they just want to care about the technical details and they don't want any of that that so-called fluff or propaganda. But you have people in Boost in the highest echelons of the community listening to literal marketing BS that was spun up in the 1960s, literally over half of a century ago. They believe that over multinational scientific consensus on these issues. And something just in your head it just hurts thinking about how do they settle on this as like the truth of the matter. And even in LLVM, right, there's evidence of people who are afraid to reveal any part of themselves at all, who have to sit in fear and guard everything about themselves. So this one person writes, to this day, I've never been able to bring myself to inform employers that I'm gay. The humiliation is just too much. It used to be that people hid homosexuality so they wouldn't get fired, right? We have people who recognize that the system is completely untenable. Of course, in the case of this specific email, this person then goes on to disparage the program that they're talking about because they feel like they're being unfairly excluded as a white person. And of course, they talk about how it's disgustingly racist. That's this idea again of reverse racism that white people, are too awesome as to never have conflicts with each other or to never face any kind of discrimination. But they're consistently missing the point, right? Not only can they not read the research, but they're also consistently missing the point that the research and the data makes, which is that like nobody is saying that white people never face discrimination, right? Like nobody's saying that white people are too privileged, that men are too privileged. It's not even that the letter of the law of the communities themselves is bad. It's not even the de jure, it's the de facto of the community, right? The unconscious exclusionary community members, the people that are continually hiding their identities and how it exhausts them, right? And puts them in fear and adds extra stress to their lives, right? It's a constantly reproving competence that's exhausting. It's having to repeatedly defend yourself. And those are the things that take attacks on you, that take attacks on our community. It's not just that they go and attack specific people or that there's specific fears, right? Like they'll even attack me, right? And not only will they attack me like in the conventional manner, they'll even make up new ways to attack me, right? So they'll give me a new gender, so I'm a lady now, And they'll say that, I'm in an academic tower, that I'm some like lofty individual that has done no work and has no intention of ever, producing anything of value in the community. I'm just trying to be one of those lofty academic people that don't actually get anything done, whatever that stereotype is about. But it's also it's not even just online, it's even in person, right? So I'm introducing myself as a volunteer, right? I'm at CS Plus Now 2019, right? I have the green volunteer shirt on, right? And then, I'm introducing myself to an attendee, and I'm talking to them, and they're like, because, they ask me, like, who are you and why are you here? And so I'm like, oh, I'm JeanHeyd Meneide. I'm a volunteer helping out. And before I could even finish my sentence, the words that came out of this man's mouth were, oh, so that's why they keep letting you back in here. This is 2019. These are the attendees at our conferences. And this is the way that they behave. This is the way they feel comfortable behaving, even in professional settings. Like, even with complete strangers, and even with organizers and other people in that room who did nothing to defend or stop that, while we were all congregated just before the first real day of the conference in the lounge area, this person felt that they could say this, and, of course, nobody did anything, right? No matter how shocked I was, no matter how I tried to explain to him that I'm also giving a talk and all this other stuff, it doesn't matter, because they have an idea of who you are before you ever get a word in edgewise. But it's also others. So this is an example from the CEP Lang Slack, right? And this is where this specific individual started attacking students, specifically students on the committee. Of course, saying that students who had 0 years of experience were infiltrating C++, and are involved with proposals and on the committee and doing horrible things, right? And the implicit assumption is that every student on the committee, of course, is not an experienced engineer, claiming that the people there don't know C well, that they don't have like 10 plus years of experience or any kind of experience at all, generally denigrating committee in general, but also kind of painting the committee as an infantile, juvenile body, and of course using students to do this, right? So this is another example of like the way that they paint and make an othering, that they do an othering, right? That they present to other people this impression of a thing that isn't real. And imagine if you were a student and you first showed up, and this is one of the first things you read. So there, you show up, you're a student, you're trying to learn, and there's many students in the CEP Lang Slack who have to sit down and kind of process the idea that they some of them who feel behind, some of them who don't feel as technical or as smart as the people they're around, and they're being told that they are not technical, that even if they had ideas, they're not welcome in general, that they need 10 plus years of experience, right? Just kind of fueling the imposter syndrome in the world. And even when you take the time to defend those people. So I responded and I clarified that the students that I know of that are on the committee, the very few of them, are amazingly accomplished. Elias Conan implemented basically half a format before he finished high school. He was one of Format's top contributors. He actually showed up at the C++ Now conference as a volunteer. And that's where he got to share a lot of his story, and he got to help with the process and get actual things that people are excited about move towards the standard. I talked about myself, who was also a student at the time, and I also talked about, other people's doctorate work, true academics, and the work they did for the committee, right? Things like Stud SIMD. And these are people, I was lucky enough to be around when Thomas Rogers, who is a libstud C++ implementer, was reviewing some of the Stud SIMD stuff, and the praise and the mind-blown awe that a libstud C++ implementer showed at Dr. Kretz's ability to handle not only the deep technical details, but tease out why their design and the performance of their design was valid and well thought out, was breathtaking to see. But yet, they still kind of throw around this idea that, I can't believe they're students, and actually disregards the actual wealth of experience that they have. And even when I went on to press this person to get them to give me examples of students that they thought were running the committee and running it into the ground, that individual couldn't give me any, right? I asked over and over and over again, and I got no examples. I got no names. I didn't even get a single proposal, not even a single idea. And it's really baffling that they say these things until you begin to understand that it's not about actually raising a serious technical grievance or addressing any kind of adequate concern. It is just about trying to make demons and devils out of people without ever actually meeting the person. It's to construct a persona about the committee, about the community, and sow disunity and discord into our communities. And so it's not even about defending just others, right? You also have to take time to defend yourself. And this is a consistent thing that happened, right? I had been anonymous on the internet, right? Most people had never seen my face. Surprise, when I actually give my first talk and people begin to see my face, the comments roll in, right? Oh my gosh, I thought you were Asian. Or I didn't know the PhD was a nigger. Hilariously, about the second comment is that that's not the first time that person made that comment. 4 or 5 years ago, they got to see my hand in a picture. And, obviously they saw that, my hand was black, right? So they actually said the exact same thing. And then the person forgot that I was black over the convenient years, and they saw it again, and they said the exact same thing. I didn't know the PhD was a nigger. It is actively, I mean, I have to give them points, right? At least they're consistent with their ability to consistently be this racist. But it's disappointing, right? That this is the kind of stuff you have to face just because you decided that, the world should see a recorded video of you, right? And so people who say that they're only focused on the technology actually aren't at all focused on just the technology, right? This idea that tech is a strict equal meritocracy continues to be a lie. And even when you just talk about it, right? You're like, maybe I should go speak at some other conferences, right? They show up and they say, it's discrimination and apartheid. And you try to brush it off, but it's still there. It still gets to you. You can't have a break, whether it's your friends, or somebody else, or a complete stranger, right? Everybody's got something to say about you trying to make a difference, or you trying to move the community forward, or you just showing your face. Even when you try to explain to those individuals that the reason that you're trying to go to these black conferences, right, these predominantly black and these black-only conferences, is because you want to go and represent the community in a positive light to these people, right? You go to Black is Tech, you go to Afro Valley, you meet wildly competent systems programmers. The thing that everybody told me didn't exist, the things that I was told were wild unicorns, and they never got any applications about them. Black men and women doing amazing things with systems programming, with C, with C++, with Rust, talking about WebAssembly and everything else. And you're the first time you're exposed to this, you're amazed because you realize that you've been fed a consistent lie about there being some kind of drought in the pipeline and there not being enough applications. But when you go to these places and you speak to these people, they're real, they're doing great work, and you're like, well, why aren't you showing up? It's like, oh yeah, it's not worth it to them, right? And they say it's not worth it. And it doesn't matter exactly how you go about this, right? Even if other people who are not me try to explain this, right? Even if they try to explain it from different angles, right? So in this Boost mailing list thread, people were throwing around, plus ones and hallelujahs, like this was, Sister Act 2, and they were all, trying to secure their part on the choir. So this person replies to a particular post that said basically that C++, and Boost and other things in general had better than average, better than general society, right? A lofty claim, representation of queer individuals. And so this queer individual shows up to say that that's actually completely at odds with the experience that they had at CS Plus Now. A conference, again, in the year that he's talking about, is 2018. I was there for that year. Of course, I can corroborate everything he says. And he says it was one of the most intensely white, straight, male experiences of my life. In other words, one of the least fluid, right? And he goes on to talk about other conferences and how he felt in those conferences and in those spaces. Of course, this isn't just some, when I first did my CS Plus experience, right, I was just a volunteer. I was still technically a nobody. But the person who reached out here and did this outreach isn't just some nobody. This is Brian Heem. And if you don't understand who Brian Heem is, Brian Heem is the main maintainer for the Super Collider, which is, an audio server programming language. Like, it's something that even I had heard of, right? And I am not an audio person at all, right? Even I had heard of the Super Collider. Even I had seen work involving the Super Collider. We completely disregarded this person's work and effort, right? So he sends us this email, right, explaining why the preconceived notions on the Boost mailing list and the basically made up statistics and made up stories that were coming out of the individuals on the Boost mailing list over this diversity discussion was wrong, and nobody replied to Brian Heem. So we completely ignored somebody who tried to inform us of his lived experience. Of course, that was the first and last time that Brian Heem ever sent an email to the Boost mailing list. The thread continues on after that with everybody, again, talking about Matchbox toy cars and why, women aren't interested and, it's their fault for not showing up. And basically, if only they would just take a better interest in computer science and actually go where the real work is and all this kind of stuff. And what makes this hilarious about us essentially excluding and ignoring Brian is that there have been recent threads about having an audio library in Boost, right? So we push away the people who would be wildly qualified to help us with that endeavor, to review those things. And rather than take anything of their concerns remotely seriously, we would instead rather make up statistics and then completely ignore people who try to tell us actual facts. And it's wild. It really doesn't matter how qualified you are. It really doesn't matter how hard you work. If they don't like what you're saying, they'll just completely ignore you and drop the ball on it, right? Nobody reached out to Brian after this. Like, nobody told nobody did anything actionable with Brian's information, so of course he's probably not going to show up for if Boost Audio ever shows up in the Boost mailing list or anywhere in the higher echelons of the CS Plus community, right? And it doesn't even matter how technical you are, right? So this is Cybrand, and they're a non-binary individual that are just giving a presentation, right? They are streaming a whole conference. They organized a whole conference, right? Microsoft's pure virtual C++. They organized an entire conference and they're giving, their talk in that conference, right? So they're talking about, meta classes and code injection and dynamic polymorphism, stuff that it was so interesting and so cool that even the foremost expert on C++ reflection actually showed up to talk to Cy about this and their previous presentations. And I was in this talk, and I was watching the chat while this was being streamed, and I cannot tell you the number of people massively preoccupied with asking, is this a boy or a girl? Dropping slurs, making completely inappropriate comments. And they're trying to just present their technical work. But for some reason, we can't even bring ourselves to pay proper attention or listen to anything they have to say about the subject. We're too busy, talking about their hair and their earrings and everything else, and asking, what's in their pants. And so it doesn't really matter how technical you are, how focused you are. They actually, the community doesn't care. Right? No matter how many times they talk about this is a strict equal meritocracy and plus one it and get on their soapbox, it never pans out in reality. The de facto reality is that they don't. They absolutely care about the way you look. And they will absolutely bully you for it. And it gets even better, right? There are whole communities dedicated to imagining that there is some grand conspiracy to let people get away with code of conduct violations that claim that the rules aren't enforced equally, that continue to try to drum this idea that reverse racism and reverse sexism and everything else is real. So this is the thread on Kotaku in Action, where they say that CPPCon is not enforcing their code of conduct. And of course, you know, the comments are as you'd expect, right? These are the nicer comments, right? It gets much worse when people who claim that they're e-journalists and everything else, right? That, you know, they can't even just stop at basic transphobia. They have to go all the way to full-on misogyny, add in a little bit of extra racism while they're at it too, involve black people for some reason. It's wild, the things that go through their head, right? But while these people had 2 days, right, to create this thread and put together a really shoddy poster board about the violation that was occurring, the Latina that I had showed you that was featured in that picture only had 30 seconds to basically game every single person in that thread and every other place where they circulated this nonsense. So the stunt that the Latina pulled was basically to jump on the grenade because a similar code of conduct violation happened at a previous talk. So in the span of less than 30 minutes, that Latina was able to leave the conference, change their clothes, come back, and then give an impromptu lightning talk in those new clothes in order to prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the code of conduct would be enforced equally. And in fact, that Latina did feel the consequences of the code of conduct. So we have individuals that believe in a strict equal meritocracy that keep trying to spend their time proving that reverse racism and other things exist, that will literally go full mask off and start and just dump out racism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, you name it, that thread had it. Not knowing that they were playing checkers as pawns, even with 2 days to prepare, to the literal 4D chess that is going on in this woman's head in the span of 30 seconds. And it never really ends, right? The threads, the comments, people who are too focused on the way you look when you're streaming an entirely free conference filled with wonderful technical data that they could easily absorb and focus on, but would rather spend time asking you if you're a boy or a girl rather than just appreciating the fact that you look fire that day. It is a never-ending struggle, a never-ending battle. So, I've established, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that we have a problem in our community, that we don't focus on the technology, that this is not a strict equal meritocracy. So where do we go from here? Well, the first start is this video, right? I made a promise to my friend that, you know what, I'll do the hard work. Right? They say that education is a fix. All right, so here's your education. Right? I provided the statistics. I provided the examples. I gathered everything I could possibly get to demonstrate that the community has a problem. A demonstrable, trackable issue, not only in the community, but with the community leaders. The people who claim that they represent all of us. We know that current spaces are not an option because they are demonstrably unsafe, because you have to be prepared to defend yourself, because you must be prepared for unprofessional behavior. And in light of that unprofessional behavior, in light of that breach of the social contract, in light of that breach of the rules that even they themselves try to impose on me and other people, the hypocrisy that is rank in these communities, yes, it is okay to make X conference or group or internship. It's okay to have a predominantly black conference. It's okay to have an only women's conference. It's okay to focus on other groups of people. In order for us to have professional growth, in order for us to be able to contribute on the merits of the technology and not be harassed and judged by the color of our skin, the way we wear our hair, or the way we were born. Things that we can't control, that this community punishes us for. And of course, the goal isn't to kick back. The goal isn't to start a fight. The goal is because current spaces seem to be incapable of handling the responsibility of our safety, for whatever their reasons. That's something for the conference organizers to figure out. But as people in this community who are facing the brunt of, not because we're not the default white male, because we're not rich, because we have varying economic backgrounds, varying skin colors, varying orientations, varying genders, and we need some way to help ourselves, because it is clear that the current leadership is not only not interested, but actively contributing to the pain, to the hurt. This is not your problem. All right? This is a single tree. And yes, 100% of the people speaking are black. And you would think that that is a good time to cry. Reverse racism. But if you don't open your eyes and step back and look at the forests, if you don't focus and apply and think, why? Why is it that a conference that has existed for 2 years, can have better representation and provide a better outlet than conferences that have existed for 2 decades? You know, I didn't really believe in 10x developers, but in 1/10 of the time, Black is Tech have done more for representation than every single other conference combined. The tree is not the problem. The one good tree out of all the bad trees is not the problem here. Pay attention to the forest. Ask yourself why the right-hand side is the way it is. And if I can help you out, no, it's not reverse somethingism. It's not reverse racism. It's not reverse sexism. Nobody's bashing straight people. We are not setting up power structures that make straight people, that make cis people, that make men, that make white people fail. Despite the vast structures that you have constructed that do make sure black people fail, that do make them feel unwelcome, that show beyond any reasonable doubt, statistically, qualitatively, quantitatively, that you have failed in your mission, in achieving your strict equal meritocracy. So until the time that the spaces that you write down and say are welcoming of everyone are in fact, are de facto safe, you, listening right now, have a right to make a place where your person will be respected, your dignity not so grotesquely violated, and where the people who claim themselves as community leaders aren't just using that title to masquerade around as abusers. And until then, until such a time as that truth happens, until such a time as people stop assuming that black people exhibit low IQ behavior, that they're only good with their hands, until they stop being surprised that black people can actually get things done, I will do my best. This is paper N2573. And on it, you'll see some names. And what I want every single underrepresented minority to understand is that a black neurodivergent person did climb the ladder, did make it to the top. Despite the slurs, despite the outright hatred, despite the hypocrisy, the rampant hostility, one of us made it to the very top, to the language that every single other language on this planet has to talk to if they want to get anything done. And so for as long as I am able, until my hair grays over, until my skin grows sallow with age, I will do everything I can. In the same way that Bryce Adelstein Lelbach held open the door and shook my hand the very first systems programming conference I attended. And he said, "Welcome. We're happy to have you, and I'm so glad you're here." For those of you with the strength, with the time, with the energy to make it all the way, I will be here. I will hold that door open for you as it was held open for me. And I will shake your hand. Welcome. I am happy to have you. And I'm so glad you're here.